All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Education Activism session of PILG 2021. I'm really looking forward to a robust, engaging discussion with our excellent panelists. My name is Hopolang Selebalo. I'm the head of research at Equal Education, and I'll be moderating today's session for the next hour and a half. Before we kick off, before I give you a bit of an intro, some background into what we'll be discussing today, I just have a few housekeeping asks before we kick off. So I would like that the cameras please be turned off, except for the panelists, of course. I think it's good to have folks see people's faces. So if our panelists can turn their cameras on once I introduce them. And if we could please keep our mics on mute, I'd really appreciate that so that there's no feedback during the discussion. And if you do want to make a comment, please just lift your hand or just write a comment or a question in the chat box and I will relay it to the panel. It would be great if you could also just let us know who you're asking the question to when it comes to the panel. And then just a quick update to let you know that our program or our panel has changed slightly. We've got a new panelist, Nziki Dulani, who's from Equal Education. And she is replacing Yolanda Sowela, who is also from Equal Education and is an equalizer. Unfortunately, Yolanda couldn't make it today, but we're very, very happy to have Nziki here. So to kick off by saying, welcome to this session, which is co-hosted by EE, Equal Education Law Center, Center for Child Law, and Section 2027. On our panel, as I mentioned, we've got Nziki Dulani, who is the head of the Western Cape at Equal Education. We've got Tejo Pala, who is the director, the executive director at Equal Education Law Center. We've got Karabo Oza, who is the director at the Center for Child Law. And we've got Demichelle Patherbridge, who is an attorney at Section 27. I'm very, very happy to have you guys here. The way that the conversation is going to run is I'm going to ask our speakers a series of questions that speak to education activism in the time of COVID-19. And just to give you some background, we all know that with the emergence of the pandemic last year, schools had to close down for quite a significant amount of time from March to June 2020. And it's been quite erratic since then over the last 2 years. And obviously this has affected learners, teachers, and schooling communities. Learners have been in and out of school. The matric exam results were indicative of the challenges that the sector faced last year. Research through NIDS-CRAM has also shown significant learning losses. Dropout rates seem to be on the rise, and access to safety nets such as the school nutrition program were compromised because of COVID-19 and how government responded to the pandemic. Our session will look at the strategies that each of our organizations used over the last 2 years to ensure that learners' access to education is not hindered, to ensure that the safety nets such as the NSNP, the National School Nutrition Program, does not fall away, and that government still provides, and that it still provides that program, amongst others. And we'll look at the strategic use of organizing during these last 2 years, engaging with government, using social and traditional media in this time, litigating to ensure that quality education is received by learners. There was something else. There was another point I wanted to make is obviously we'll discuss the gains and the challenges of these different tactics and strategies that we used during this period. So let me kick off by asking my comrade Nziki on her perspective on the impact of COVID-19 on education since the emergence of the pandemic. How through your experience as a head of province has this affected equalizers, learners, teachers? What has it meant for teaching time, learning time, and what have the disruptions meant?
Can you hear me, Hoops?
I can.
Loud and clear. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us here. I think, as you said, my name is Ntsiki Lulani. I am the head of organizing in the Western Cape at Equal Education. I think firstly, I want to say that it's unfortunate that we had a pandemic, but I also want to say the impact that the pandemic had is actually, it highlighted the issues that we've been speaking about at Equal Education, right? They became more worse, the inequality that we've been speaking about within the education system. So the issues that were highlighted by the pandemic were actually not new issues, but they got to be more exposed now to everyone. You can quickly see the difference between a learner who's in a public school and a learner who's in a private school. And I think it highlighted a lot of things that Equal Education has been campaigning for over 13 years. And when I'm mentioning those things, I'm speaking about the issue of psychosocial support. This has been one of the campaigns that we've been campaigning for, where we've been demanding psychosocial support in all the schools in South Africa. And the pandemic then came with like social issues, school issues. It meant also that learners needed psychologists in schools, because the lost time of learning during that time, the closing of like almost 3 months, learners not being at school, it meant that learners within the working class and marginalized schools are losing a lot during that time. And we know this is not the first time. We know that learners within public schools and marginalized schools are always having the one that are having to be doing the catch-up plan within the education system. And I'm speaking about the system as a whole now, even before the pandemic, the system of not having a library in your school, a functioning library in your school, the system of you having to work 4 hours in order for you to get to school, the system of just not having adequate resources within your school to be getting the education that you deserve as a learner within the school. And the pandemic highlighted that. And it also didn't only highlight that for the psychosocial support for learners, but also for teachers. I remember when we went into schools to actually the first time when schools were happening and teachers started saying, we're having to play the role of being teachers into the learners, but also social workers into the same learners, parents into the same learners. And these were the issues that we faced even before the pandemic, and the government not actually accounting or actually implementing and making sure that psychologists are at schools. And in that process, we also started speaking about other challenges that learners are facing in schools, and food security became a highlight of that. And it didn't only start though in learners. We need to also remember that learners are part of the community. It started when schools were closed. You could see that community members are struggling in terms of food. Parents had been retrenched in their work because of the pandemic and the inequalities that the pandemic has brought. It meant that a learner is also affected by not having food at home. It meant a learner needed to think about the food that they actually were receiving at school. So it didn't only become an issue of learners, but it also started within the communities that we live in of not having food security. Then it went to school. We know how much the food security has like highlighted as the most important thing during this time. And it then went back to school of saying not having school feeding scheme during a time of a pandemic. We know that a lot of learners are coming from different backgrounds, and those different backgrounds, it means a lot of their parents don't even afford to provide a meal for them. And it's not even the parents' fault, it's the system's fault of the retrenchment of parents being unemployed during that time. And we know the importance of having food security in terms of school at this point in time, the feeding scheme. And we know that a lot of learners and millions of learners in South Africa are dependent on the school nutrition program. And in that process, then food security became a very highlighted issue. And we needed to attend to, and learners saying to us, the meal that I was getting at school, it made a difference to me. Now I'm not getting that meal. It means the whole day I can sit with my siblings without getting any food. And the pandemic was very personal to the Black marginalized communities and Black marginalized schools and public schools during this time, because the issues that and the inequalities that public schools are facing, they're very personal to learners and teachers during this time. And the education as a whole, and we know of different things that happened during the pandemic. And I'm sure other panelists are going to speak about the issues of like budget cuts within the education system, and that contributed a lot into the inequalities that were already existing during this pandemic. And I want to repeat this again, that the pandemic highlighted issues that were already existing, and it highlighted them more because we saw the negligence of our government, and the government that was not doing anything to tackle those issues that public schools were facing during this time. And I don't also want us to speak about the pandemic in the past tense. We need to speak about the pandemic in the present tense, because we're still facing those inequalities. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ntiki, and thanks for that great outline. The fact that you point out that the system is personal, whether the system lets you down or performs well, it's personal, you know. And with COVID, the situation in our society also now played out in the school. Everything was affected, you know. I like the fact that you're talking about historic failures as well. So this is not, you know, it wasn't like things were going along swimmingly and then we got to this point and, you know, things broke. It's the fact that things were broken before that has made the situation particularly difficult for learners and teachers. From food, as you mentioned, to issues of psychosocial support that we've been advocating for years, but like only now government is waking up to the necessity of providing that support. I would like to call on Tejo to speak to us about the historic failures that Ntiki has alluded to, from infrastructure and so on. Tejo?
Thanks a lot, Upalan. I mean, Ntiki has really done a good job in really contextualizing the kind of environment or context which COVID-19 found our education system in. And really the buzzword a lot of us have heard over the past few days is really how COVID is the inequality pandemic. And really what COVID did, not just in education, but in other sectors, is that it amplified existing inequalities. And for the education system, that really meant that COVID found a system which wasn't a system which is personified by inequalities, a system where schools already had inadequate infrastructure, where overcrowding was already an issue, and now we were sitting trying to think around social distancing and how would you social distance children in schools in contexts where schools already did not have sufficient classrooms, were already overcrowded, and a system where every year we sit with over 20,000 learners who don't have a place in school. COVID-19 also found an education system where water and sanitation was inadequate, where we still have pit latrines in some schools in South Africa, despite the fact that pit latrines are illegal and shouldn't be present. And so really what Ntiki has painted for us, and you know, there's not much more for me to add, was really a context which was already characterized by inequality. And so in these unprecedented times, the sector had to now try and respond where this pandemic exacerbated these inequalities that we already collectively were fighting to dismantle, were fighting to address. And the reality is these inequalities really are a picture of the legacy of apartheid in South Africa. And despite us trying to bring in a new Schools Act, And despite the promise of basic education, which is immediately realizable and not subject to any resource limitations, which we find in our Constitution in Section 29, despite this promise, COVID-19 found an education system which was characterized by inequalities, which was characterized by the Black child or the child who came from a poorer working class communities who didn't have much, and it just amplified that. And through our talk today, we'll just really speak about how that was for them and what their lived reality around that was, particularly also for learners, for children with disabilities and children in special schools who also came from special schools which are historically under-resourced in South Africa, and that's also something we'll pick on. So really, for me, it was a system which was already one of inequality, which was met and ravaged by an inequality pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Tejo. When you speak about school infrastructure overcrowding, limited access to classrooms, limited access to non-existent access actually to water, to toilets. We've also one of the reasons that government often cites is related to money, and it's been a pattern for the last couple of years. But we saw an absolute hemorrhaging last year with deep cuts within the sectoral budget. And I'd just like Demi to talk us through what the implications of these budget cuts were on the system broadly, on school infrastructure specifically, and obviously how this all, like in the context of COVID, what this means for learners and teachers and school communities.
Thanks, Hopelang. Yes, you're exactly right. One of the biggest impacts that we saw on education during the time of COVID, and even now, as we said in the present, is that there were massive budget cuts to the education budget. And the biggest reason for this was because the sector was considered a donor to COVID relief last year. And you can see this in the special adjustment budget that was published by National Treasury around June last year, where you can see these massive cuts for yourself. And the one that we had noted the most, and which was one of the biggest for education, was cuts to the education infrastructure grant. And I'm sure, as many know already, this is a grant specifically dedicated to giving provinces money so that they can attend to school infrastructure projects, problems in their provinces. And to give you an idea, around 2.2 billion rand was just completely removed from this grant last year. And then 4.4 billion was reprioritized in order to mitigate, it was given to COVID-related needs like PPEs, like sanitizer, like transporting water tanks to schools. So massive cuts. And in a portfolio committee meeting last year, just a month afterwards in July, the Department of Education actually admitted that this translated into just under 2,000 school infrastructure projects being completely suspended. Which has huge implications. And of course, the Education Infrastructure Grant wasn't the only one to receive slashes. We know that money that the South African Council for Educators would have gotten was, some money was cut. We know that the Second Chance Matric program had cuts. Conditional grants that went towards math, science, and technology was cut. Conditional grants that went to learners with severe to profound intellectual disabilities were cut. So really across the education sector, there was money that was taken. And looking forward, even though
Sasha, could you mute, please?
You want to sit down? Drink water.
Oh wow. Leave a note. Let me see if I can mute. Sorry, Demi.
don't worry.
I'm on this Education Activism.
All right, I think we're all, Tevin, I think we're muted now. If folks could just keep their microphones muted, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to pick up where I left off, while some money has been recovered in the new budget, and for example, we see that the Education Infrastructure Grant has now received a bit more money. we know, for example, that when it comes to school infrastructure projects, some of these haven't resumed at all. And there's just no evidence from the DBE on how they're going to now work in the projects that were stopped last year and still try and meet the targets going forward. So I think provisioning in public schools was severely affected. And this is going to cause a lot of knock-on effects going forward. And for example, like in infrastructure, we now have further delayed backlogs in public schools, which is just like everyone has said, just further perpetuating this cycle of unequal access to basic education.
Thanks, Demi. And I mean, just talking about the budget, we're heading towards MTBPS, the Medium-Term Budget Policy Statement 2021 in November, and a lot of collaboration. So one of the many tactics I think that emerged in the time of COVID, not that it didn't exist before, but I do think that civil society organizations and social movements have definitely banded together in this time. And through one of the focal points, or one of the issue areas that we've been focusing on, is around budget advocacy and what these budget cuts mean for social services such as education. It defies logic that money would be taken away when it's actually quite urgently needed to ensure that learners go back to school. So in the midst of learners not being able to be in school full time, the department has kind of, not necessarily a roadshow, but has spoken about remote learning and ICT and support programs on television to help matric learners in particular. But we've heard from our equalizers that these aren't, sufficient provisions to help them learn in this time while they're at home. Karabo, could you talk us about what remote learning has looked like at this time, whether it works even in our context, considering, again, our history, and what the departments can and can't do, at least what we know the departments can and can't do?
Thank you so much. I think, as you say, Hopelang, the starting point is the picture that my co-panelists have painted, which is one of, we were already behind in trying to level the playing field. If anything, in my view right now, we have regressed. I think, as Seho was saying, Section 29 of the Constitution and the law saying that the right to basic education is not subject to progressive realization is a farce. It's we are in a state where we are actually regressing, and one talks about this with a heavy heart, because we know it affects the lives of the next generation, the current generation. It's a huge issue, and I think we were going to see the impact for long. So with that as a starting point, where you have families who lack access to the basics, who don't work anymore, who are struggling to feed their children, and now we're saying, okay, now we're going to switch on to this remote learning, remote learning, as well as, remember the rotational approach that was taken as well. I mean, and we know the challenges in relation to that. I mean, some reports are saying that, when you look at the rotational learning, and including also the online approaches, the hybrid kind of learning, learners have lost about 50-something% of their learning time. So clearly that already indicates to you that they haven't received as much as they would have received. And then you move on to the fact that now you have these online learning platforms and methods that you're trying to use, but are they really accessible? So we know the issues in relation to accessing the devices. We know that in Eastern Cape last year, there was even litigation about the tenders that people got for the devices. That, it did look like in the end, the learners did get the devices, but there were fights also about that. Education is always impacted by so many issues, such as even the tenders for who's going to supply the tablets to the learners. And then we then have this assumption that everybody is able to navigate the online material on their own and understand it, which is a problem. And you can only imagine how, if in matric and it's the most important year of your schooling, and the building blocks have not been that great. So you have already last year where if you're in grade 11, there were challenges because of COVID. There were probably challenges before then. We know also there's issues there in terms of our quality of education. Now you're supposed to use these platforms where you don't really have proper support in relation to how you engage with the material and preparing yourself. And I think even Demi mentioned how there was also cuts to the matric programs that support, the learners. So that definitely then affects the output. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned that we assume also is that everybody has access to devices, everybody has access to data and the skills, but we know that's not the truth. It's a big problem everywhere. I mean, I work at the university, and even here we're having debates about all the pros and cons and how learners have struggled, university students. So you can only imagine, even for high school learners, having to navigate education kind of on their own. And actually, we need to be doing some research to ask these learners, how did they find these ways of having to kind of teach themselves, and what has been the support that they receive? Because I think we do need to reflect a bit about that, because it's all good and well to say, oh, remote learning, online learning and all that is the new thing that's coming. But at university level, we're already getting reports that clearly say that there's a challenge. You can't really just say that. So for our learners in high schools and in primary school, it's even worse, I would say. It's not good enough to just assume that because you've made the platforms available and accessible, and I know we know some of the platforms are zero rated in terms of data and all that, it's not enough. We know that high school and primary school requires you to have somebody who helps you navigate the material. And more importantly, if the building blocks have been lacking, you are not going to be able to suddenly overnight guide yourself through a metric curriculum and actually produce good results. So I think I agree that we are in a dire situation. We're still going to see the impact of this for a long time. And I agree with my co-panelists that the problem is also how we had not done things prior to COVID. We already had such disparities. We already had such inequality, and now it's been exacerbated by COVID. And yes, as I say, I talk about this with a heavy heart, because I don't know what we're saying about the constitutional right to education and what it's supposed to mean. And we need to then put our heads together and look at all these issues, the budgets, the quality, the infrastructure, because all of that affects what our children and our siblings and everybody in the country is going to get out of our education system. Let me stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Karabo. I think you've articulated the many prongs of concern, of worry, of what it all means for the organizations that sit on this panel and us more broadly. When you were talking about learning losses, I remembered that we ran a survey last year. I think it was in May, of about 400 learners, 400 equalizers, and about 44% of the equalizers that we spoke to then said that they'd been given workbooks to take home during the hard lockdown. So over a good 50% had absolutely nothing. And the older learners were more likely to have been given this material than the younger learners. So for months, young children sat without anything to stimulate, to help with their learning. And even then, as you mentioned, you need support. You can't do it on your own. About 65% of our learners had said they access the internet at home, and 25% of our learners said that they really struggle with network and affording data. So it feels almost idealistic that the department punts remote learning as this viable solution rather than urgently addressing what needs to happen within schools to ensure that learners can actually go back full time, which takes me back to Nziki's point of the fact that we are in the midst of COVID, and it's really, really concerning about what the implications are going to be for this generation and for a long time to come. I see that there are points there in the chat, and I will just quickly read through them, but I just want to ask Tejo another question. Since our session mainly talks about the strategies and the tactics that we used, Tejo, as the Law Center, as EE, as the Center for Child Law and Section 27, I wanted to know in what ways we engage the state with the shortcomings that we identified in the time of COVID, like the worrisome, issues that were coming out during this pandemic. How did we engage the state? When did we do this? And do you believe that this was successful? And if any of my other panelists would like to hop onto this particular point after Tejo, please do come in.
Thanks, Hobbs. So when the pandemic and the national state of disaster was declared, we then had the National Minister of Education announcing that schools would be open with effect from the 18th of March 2020. At the time, it was an unprecedented time. We all thought that it would just be a period of 2 weeks or 21 days. And it soon became very clear to us as civil society and as organizations working in education, that actually it wasn't going to be 21 days, and that actually there wasn't decisions which they needed to make, decisions which we realized were novel decisions. I think also our way of working, particularly between Equal Education Law Centre and EE, during this time of crisis, where a lot of people were struggling to organize, a lot of people were struggling to access lawyers and legal support, that very unique relationship where we were already partnered with the movement, where we were already able to know what is going on in the ground, what is the ground experiencing, what are learner experiences through the surveys which EE was doing, was able to make us then engage with government on the lived experience of learners, what was going on, what did a response to COVID-19 need to look like, and how would an adequate response respond to not just, to respond to the inequalities which we have, respond to the varying different contexts which learners have in our education system. And so through this direct engagement, we were then able to really kind of have an influence on the sort of directions which were published, to then also build a relationship with government where we formed part of their deliberations, formed part of giving comments, robust comments on some of the directions which were published. And through this backwards and forwards relationship, which started all the way back in March, we've seen how a lot of the recommendations we've made on how directions should look like. How does one still protect the right to basic education during this time? How does one make sure that we don't lose a lot of learning time? We've seen a lot of the suggestions we've made get taken on wholesale. Sometimes, Hobbs, you'll remember, we've done drafts to directions where all our wording has been taken. And so it's really shown how, as civil society, we recognized our role. We recognized the collaborative nature of how we could work with DBE, and the need for us really to then stand up and be part of that process. So it's really been a process of direct engagement, and that's how we started that relationship, and still, in fact, continue to do so, because as Nziki says, COVID-19 is still with us, and it will continue to have an impact on our education.
I think it's a bit of a unique experience, this kind of a bordering on collegial relationship with the state, because we were all thrown by this moment, and grappling in the dark initially. And I like the fact that there was at least some positive movement in how we could relate to the state, and push for learners' rights to be realized. But as we know, hasn't always been the case, and it certainly hasn't always been the case in this context. And this leads me to a question that Nicola actually posed here that I would like to throw at Demi, about us in South Africa. It says, is there room for us in SA to use the right to education to push government on fiscal policy or budgets? So Demi, could you kind of speak to the work that we've done, Equal Education Law Centre, Section 27, on advocating for increased budgets, better use of budgets, accountability and transparency around budgeting? And do you believe that it's sufficient, this work that we're doing? Do we need to push harder, considering what we've seen over the last 18 or so months?
Yeah, thanks, Hopelang. I think that's a really great question, because we've all become very aware that the government is taking decisions on budgets, and it looks like the opportunity for civil society is there to engage on paper, but when it actually tries to engage on platforms that have been created by National Treasury or the Department of Education, sometimes it looks like these conversations are really just tick box exercises. And I think it's an important question, sorry, now to ask whether or not litigation is the way to go when trying to challenge budget allocations. Apologies. I think in the time of COVID, from my experience with trying to take the state to court on their decisions on budget making, it seemed like it would have been very difficult to try and challenge the decisions the state was making in a time of emergency. And I think because courts are very, very skittish to give direct orders to the state on how it should spend its money, it was something at the time that we were very cautious of. I think going forward, however, it may become more important to look to other mechanisms other than litigation. Like you said, Hopalong, there has been a lot of civil society activity. I know that the Budget Justice Coalition has often made submissions on what the implications of the budget cuts are, has done very detailed analysis on how exactly spending is decreasing, even if it looks like it's increasing, which I think is important information to highlight. And I think it's important to just keep on collaborating and putting weight as a collective on these platforms, and to just make our voice be heard. And I think so. I think that there are places for that, and I think that public participation, we just kind of have to keep on at it with public participation, even though it looks like sometimes the results are a little bit dim. But yeah, just to answer the question, I think going forward with litigation, I'm still a little bit skittish, just because we are still in crisis, and it may be very difficult to try and question the government on why, as a litigation strategy, why it's making the decisions it is. But I do think that other platforms that will involve civil society are definitely worth engaging on.
Okay. Great, thanks, Demi. I just want to note to our audience, please do feel free to pop in a question in the chat or a comment in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and jump in. So it's a free flow discussion. Please don't feel limited. Tejo, please come in.
Perhaps I just wanted to add on the issue of budget. For me, I've always found it quite concerning, particularly in respect of the right to basic education and where budgets get reduced for the right to basic education. And I really think there's a need for us to start realizing and positioning the fact that this right is a unique right in our constitution. It is the one right that is supposed to be immediately realizable. We have had the ConCourt on numerous occasions assert and confirm that this right is not subject to budget allocations and to budget illustrations. And so when you have austerity measures playing around the right to education, for me, that makes me, as Karabo says, it's quite disheartening. It's quite concerning, because it just shows a treatment of the right to education on par with other socioeconomic rights, and the lack of an understanding or realization that really the right to education is a special right and is a different right. And you don't see this translating in the manner in which our budgeting is taking place. And for me, that's quite concerning. It's something we do need to take on as civil society involved in education and budget justice.
Do you feel the same way, or do you hold the same view as Demi around litigating around this issue? Ntiki, I see you, and I'll come to you just now.
As Demi says, a lot of us were not sure, because we were in a state of crisis. We were in an unprecedented time. But I must admit, at the back of my mind, I do perhaps think one could have litigated, for example, the cutting down of the infrastructure budget at a time of crisis, a time where we already have infrastructure backlogs, where the state is already behind on their various targets on the norms and standards for education. And then you have an infrastructure budget being cut at a time of crisis, a budget that's linked to a right that's immediately realizable. And in fact, infrastructure is one of the things that will enable children to be able to continue to learn during a pandemic and during COVID-19. So we didn't do it, but perhaps we should have tried.
Okay, interesting. I would like to take Ntiki's hand. I see Lolo and Karabo. If you want to jump in, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll go to the comments, to the chat box. So Ntiki and then Lolo.
Yeah, I think I'm quite triggered by this conversation, right? Because I think Utseho has especially captured me. I wanted to speak about this issue of budget cut and the lack of political will within our government, right? This is the same government, exactly what Utseho said, that came with a law now that is called the Minimum Uniform Norms and Standards for School Infrastructure. But this is also the same government that is cutting budget. So you sit and ask yourself of what is exactly going on, you're failing to implement and making sure that schools have proper infrastructure, but you're the same person that is cutting budget during this time. And it speaks to it speaks to the decades and decades of we'll have to face this so much inequality within the education system. It speaks to the catch-up plan, is a lack of a better word, that we'll have to face as like these like marginalized public schools with this like unequal education system. And it for me, I think it speaks to there's still more that we need to do. And I think the pandemic also has made the NGO sector seem reactionary to the issues. And I don't think we are. I don't think we are. I don't think we are reactional to those issues. And these are the issues that we've been speaking about, but it also speaks to the lack of political will within our government. And that's something we really need to challenge. You can't put a beautiful policy in paper, in black and white, and then cut the same budget for something else. And I think it was even problematic to see that the education sector was regarded as a donor department during a pandemic where we've been facing so much inequality. It was supposed to be a frontline department because it speaks a lot within the education system. So it's really, for me, it just painted out a lack of political will and something that we've been talking about during this time. Thank you.
I want to add my 2 cents, but I'll hold off for a second. Lolo, is your hand still up?
Yes, I just put it down so that I don't forget.
Okay, sure. Please come in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this engagement. I think the ladies are really on point. I enjoyed Nziki's submission, and of course, I think Tseho is and she is not budging on the fact that there's issues of accountability, and I think Demi's presentation as well. I'm just thinking out loud here, and please bear with me. So I think I take cognizant of what Teko is really putting emphasis on in terms of just the strategies and the gains that have been made with dealing with DBE. And there's a point that unfortunately I wasn't in yesterday's discussion, but I know that Dr. Mbete made a point about people living locally and not nationally. Thus, their quality of life is determined by their experiences in the immediate surroundings. And this, I know, and maybe I'm reaching, please correct me. But I think in hindsight, as we sit now, we are aware that as much as the department was determined to be a donor department, we sit now and we know that digital vibes has happened. We know that there's been, oh my God, a lot went wrong where PPE procurement is concerned. So the emphasis on litigation and litigating with this in mind, is there a way that people and basically departments can be, because there's intersections here. Money was pulled away from education, placed correctly where it should be in health. But we know that there has been, what do I say? We know that there has been, it's not a lack of accountability, but there's just misusage of money. How do you then hold people accountable with this in mind? Because it's money that was not allocated to the Department of Health initially, in terms of, we got here because of certain things. But we know that this money was not utilized correctly. How do you then go back and say, we have had to put on hold very crucial infrastructure programs, but money was just siphoned off? And hold and bring in those discussions in terms of holding people to the fore, because the intersectionality for me is what I'm grappling with, because and I don't know whether I'm making sense. That's just my thinking at the moment.
Would anybody like to take a stab at responding to Lolo? Karabo, do you?
I'm thinking it's a very difficult question, but I think something that Tseho said and about why one doesn't litigate at one point and all that is that she also mentioned your work with EELC on and in Section 27 on gathering evidence So we need to gather this evidence and be able to unpack it. So obviously, if we're going to say we want to approach the court to say, well, you know, there can't be that all this money was taken from here, moved from there, and now we're experiencing the budget cuts. You have to have the evidence to take the court with you to be able to at least, you know, get DBE to be held accountable. I'm not so sure about how they would, for instance, hold health accountable in that space, because the money has gone, and if you know if it's misspent there, you know, I mean, obviously there's supposed to be criminal charges and all that for people who stole money, but that is a separate kind of process. I think how I would think we would use this information is to gather the evidence properly, get our experts to analyze the budget and the transfers of the monies and all that, and have that evidence as part of your litigation as to why government is failing in relation to education, is taking all these decisions where money gets misused, which we already were seeing. I mean, there were provinces that would get money and underspend and still have infrastructure problems and things like that. So, and Seho is very correct that, you know, sometimes we are reluctant about litigating these because we shouldn't assume that the court will get it immediately. So the more we collaborate, we get evidence, we get expert evidence that will unpack these issues. And we're trying, I think most of us right now are focusing a lot on these issues of budgeting and the movings of monies and things like that, so that we are able to ourselves understand it, explain it to the courts, and be able to make a case for why it's such a violation of children's rights to education to have a system that allows these kind of things. I mean, I think we're still going to talk about the school nutrition case. I mean, one of the things I remember was how the Minister of Education was trying to say, when the children are at home, they are DSD's responsibility, they're not my responsibility, and all those things. And those things actually make you also reflect about how there's a siloed approach to constitutional rights, to socioeconomic rights, which is also a wrong thing, because, you know, these rights are quite interlinked. You have children who are not eating, who have malnutrition, they end up in hospitals if they don't, you know, we have to reflect about it. And I think most of us are now doing quite a lot of work around that, but it's not easy work, because whichever forum you're gonna take to try and get remedy, you must be able to unpack these issues in a way that's clear, and the remedy that you can get must also be one that's realistic and practical. So yeah, so I think maybe let me allow to add, but those are just my views for now.
Thanks so much, Karabo. Teho, please come in. I want us to wrap up this conversation in the next 3 minutes before I jump to Vanessa, and then we move.
So I think, not to answer directly, but just to add that budget justice and work around budget, I think it is part and parcel of our work and needs to remain part and parcel of our work. It's part of our monitoring, it's part of our writing back, it's part of our holding government to account. Our work with parliaments and parliamentary monitoring, which I'll speak to later, is also part of that work in ensuring that we have some sort of budget justice. It sits not just in our courtrooms or through litigation, but I think true accountability is where that work, you know, runs through our work and is always there. And around this whole thing about localities and communities and communities being affected at their local points, I think that's something we've been cognizant of, particularly in this pandemic, particularly where it was hard to organize. And that's when we realized that, as I said at the beginning, the power of movement lawyering, the power of lawyers who do not just sit detached from communities, detached from localities, because in a moment of crisis, lawyers who are movement lawyers and who are community lawyers are able to support communities and what they're feeling at grassroots levels much quicker through relationships with community advice officers like KUASA, with our relationships with EE. Just wanted to add that, Hobbs.
Hopalong, can I
yes,
say something?
Come in, Demi.
Sorry, I struggle with my raise hand function. I just wanted to add on the litigation issue. You know, even if we were skittish to directly confront this, you know, budgetary decision making, one could always root the problem as a violation of the right to basic education. You know, so that the budget cuts and the spending perhaps take a background in our you know, what we want to present, but that we say when a child cannot learn properly in a school that has bad public infrastructure, a bad school infrastructure, it's a violation of the rights. You know, and to bring a case that way, like a violations approach, instead of relying precisely on the budgetary decisions, and then leave it to the department to figure out how they'll fix the problem, how they will sort out the budgetary decision-making, and find the funds. So that's also a potential avenue if one wanted to litigate that way.
Just before I move on to Vanessa quickly, I saw a question about alternative methods and how effective they are in terms of advocacy in relation to the budget, which I thought was an excellent question. I think it's a slow burn process. It's not an easy process. These engagements for National Treasury and provincial education departments and the DBE about how their money is used, whether it's under expenditure and underperformance, or money just being hacked away, even though we know that it's urgently needed. But there are like small strides that are being made. And it seems that it's not safety in numbers, but like the more of us there are, the more responsive the state seems to be in our advocacy, So I remember Debbie spoke about the supplementary budget for last year, where we saw those funds being cut away from basic education and other sectors. And I think it was by the time the MTBPS rolled around last year, so in around October, we saw that some additional, well, not some additional money, but some money had been put back to the education sector, In the past, we wrote quite a number of statements and, a lot of media work. So another one of the tactics or strategies that we use around, again, money being taken away from school infrastructure in the February budget. But because there was such, the fact that we were contesting this in such a loud manner, by the time that the MTBPS rolled around again, we saw that money was actually put back towards school infrastructure grants. So it moves slowly. Advocacy does work. I think it works when there's great collaboration between different organizations. If your message is very clear and if you use different avenues to get your message out. So your media, I'm trying to think what else, your organizing, public pressure. I think our government, I would like to say our government doesn't like to be embarrassed, but I don't think that's the truth. But yeah, the government has been quite responsive to, pressure from civil society and the public. And then, yes, Vanessa, I'm sorry it's taken long to get to you, and then we'll move.
No problem. Thanks, Hoppelang. I raised my hand in response to a comment in the chat from Willeen about whether it isn't necessary to start litigation again in terms of the right to education for children with severe to profound intellectual disability. Just background, these learners are refused admission at public schools and attend NGO-managed special care centers. And Karabo may want to add to this. We have followed a process of working collaboratively and cooperatively with government, mostly in the Western Cape where we are based. And more recently from 2018 National DBE. We had some results in terms of funding from Western Cape government, in terms of funding from DSD. However, DBE and WCD remain intransigent. They have made various commitments, which I think slowed down our advocacy. And so we are discussing this matter with Centre for Child Law, specifically looking at budget allocations and inequality in terms of children in school and children at special care centres, and then also regulations around funding, etc. So yes, we are looking at litigation again, and I must tell you that this has been a 23-year battle. We went to court in 2007, received the judgment in 2010. And so we've had concerted advocacy since then, and we do feel at the moment that litigation may be our last resort. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Is it Veline?
Yes, it is. Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can. And
All
then
right,
we'll wrap
thank
up with you before we move.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that answer. I'm very intrigued by Hopelang, your comment earlier that we sometimes need to, push for the litigation, and then we need to leave it up to, or perhaps Demichelle said it, we need to leave it up to the state then to decide what they do once we've achieved that rights-based claim. So if we push for equal education, for example, children with severe and profound intellectual disabilities, and we get that outcome in the courts, then hopefully, that's something that we've got on paper. But this case, from 2010 shows that it doesn't exactly happen. In this instance, they did come up with a solution that actually wasn't workable. And despite the continued advocacy of civil society, they haven't changed it, and it's now actually in a worse situation than it was before. The background to this issue is that there was allocation by the Department of Health at some point and DSD towards the education of these children, and not the Department of Basic Education. And they continue to pass the buck, and DSD seems to be coming to the party, but not the Department of Education. But my fear is if one does bring litigation like this and you only base it on the rights-based claim, and you don't actually look clearly into what kind of methods we can use to challenge the budgetary allocations, then we might have, again, the same outcome, which is trying to advocate and trying to push for compliance with a court order, trying to monitor it at a parliamentary level, which the Western Cape Forum for Intellectual Disability has done admirably, and still not coming out with joy.
Thanks, Veline. Karabo, you want to respond?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to be very quick, just to say that Vanessa, as she mentioned, we are actually started the process. We had to start with a legal opinion and assess what happened since 2010. When one unpacks the judgment, the court order of 2010, there are a lot of gaps, and that's one of the things. That's why we're now doing quite an intense process with Vanessa and the organization they represent, where we're going to gather the information, and also there's detailed reports about all the parliamentary processes and other engagements that have taken place, and it certainly will help to go further than that other order. I mean, the first time I looked at that, I was like, it was a good, well-intended and all that, but when you look at it realistically, Veline, you will see that there were some gaps, and that's why there were practical issues, and budget certainly is one of the big issues. And if all of us know that when it comes to children with disabilities, if anything, they've always been left behind. So we are being quite careful and very meticulous in the information that we're going to gather, so that it actually helps us to get something more substantive from the court. And if anything, if we're monitoring, we're not leaving it up to them to do the how, because you have to go an extra step now, as you said. Having left it up to them kind of has left these gaps that Vanessa and them have been struggling with for years and years. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to move us on. The way we've structured this conversation is that we give you 2 case studies that illustrate how we use the different strategies and tactics to push for particular rights. So that's the National School Nutrition Program and our work around learners with disabilities. So in relation to the NSNP, I would like to ask Nziki, we use like several methods here. We went from organizing, there was research involved, there was engagement with the states, there was litigation, there was organizing, So from you, Nziki, I want to know, how did we organize in a time when we couldn't be in contact? We're going through all various levels of lockdown. We need to mobilize our members. We need to amplify these issues. We need to be creative, but it's just so limited. Like what we can do seems so limited. Could you talk us through the strategies that we used at that time?
Yeah, I think it was more than limited, it was just challenging. And I think different organizations and different organizing spaces would actually agree with me, because we're using the traditional way of organizing, right? And we're using it because the people and the masses that we are organized with are from the ground. They don't have resources, they don't have smartphones to actually be active in things like social media and other things. However, so while we're sitting waiting for the DBE to come in and say when learners are going back from school, we also realize that we are starting to be also disconnected with our members, because now the spaces we used to create, spaces like youth groups where you meet each and every week, speak about the issues that learners are facing and finding solutions, going on the ground, doing protests. And I want to make different, like, example. During the state of the provincial province address would be outside the provincial parliaments to say, we're here as equal education, we're here as learners from equal education demanding the right to basic education. And those things were hard, right? They were not happening because these meetings were happening via Zoom, and these meetings are not open to the public. And when I mean the public, I mean learners that are directly affected by these issues. And then we started.
Sorry, Nziki. Noma, please go ahead, Nziki.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, so we started coming with different creative ideas, and it meant at that time we needed to come together, the organizing, the research, different departments, media departments. We need to come together and try and find ways to better organize during this time. And we started we started taking a direction of doing surveys, right? Through calling our members to say, and at that point, we're just doing a check-in, right? How are you? How are things at home? How are you? It's been 2 months without school. And that led to the other thing, right? Because that was just a uniform check-in to all of our members. And in all of the check-ins we did with our members, all of our members started saying, things are not okay at home. We don't have food at home. We have not been at school for about 2 months now. The feeding scheme is like not here, and it's playing a very big role at this point in time. And we got that from all the 5 different provinces that we actually organized in. And this was the first time after a long time we would do calls within our members and get this one uniform things and this one struggle, you know, because we're organizing KZN, then as in KZN would say we have a scholar transport issue in the Western Cape, they say school safety. In Eastern Cape and in Limpopo, they would say sanitation, school infrastructure. But this was one time where learners came out strongly to say food security is now a real issue within our schools. And we started using different forms of organizing. We started doing Facebook Lives, where we're actually allowing our members to come and say, these are the issues that we face. Let's invite different people. Let's invite different people to come and speak to different issues. And this was a way of us saying, because of the pandemic, we can't be disconnected with these issues, because these are the issues that we face each and every day. But at that point, it was said because there was no platform that was bringing us together, and we needed to think out of the box and start organizing in a different ways. But through even those organizing, it meant there are other members within that we are leaving behind, because for example, Elena in Twin KZN doesn't have a smartphone. It means they can't form part of the Facebook Live discussion that is happening. It also meant that and reminded us the importance of also traditional organizing, and it was hard because of the pandemic. But we then started meeting like in a group of 15, social distancing, and making sure that the voices of these learners are heard. It was quite a very challenging time, but we started thinking out of the box and started to find creative way of organizing. And survey actually, and this Facebook Live and social media became one of the important things, important tools we use in terms of organizing. It has its own advantages, but it also assisted us in getting the voice of the affected during this time and getting solutions into the issues that we face. And I want to say, although it was challenging, we were able to come out with the National School Nutrition Program as part of our campaign through these challenges in organizing through social media, doing calls, doing surveys. Because what was important to us, it was for us to say, what are the issues that we are now currently facing through a just normal check-in with our members, a check-in of saying, how are things? You've been out of schools. And they were like, we hear the part about the curriculum and other things, but food security is becoming a problem now during this time. So yeah, it was challenging, but surveys, social media discussions that were happening were very important, and starting to organize in small groups where we call learners to say, let's do this survey, let's try and find the solutions into these issues. So yeah.
Thanks, Nziki. Like, I definitely remember the work that went into, I think it was like May, June, you know, where the minister had basically said, we are only going to restart the NSNP in schools, you know, and we know at the time, like, other than the grade 7s and 12s, everybody else was at home. And as you said, equalizers had identified food security as their struggle. And just the creative, you know, the multiple creative tactics that we used. We were on a bridge in Gauteng.
Yeah, doing a protest.
Yes, doing a little protest. So few of us, you know, there was graffiti. It was actually really lovely. But there were obviously other elements to this work. And Tejo, you were working more around the engagement with the department, the research that we conducted around like alternative, what other countries are doing to ensure that learners have access to food in the time of the pandemic, that the state, that our government was not even looking to listen to when we were coming up with these proposals that eventually led to litigation. Could you talk us through how, you know, how we used these different techniques? Yes, can you hear me?
Sorry, before Tejo comes in, I forgot something. I also wanted to say, also these surveys highlighted that the DBE, maybe specifically at this point in time, they didn't have a plan during a pandemic about the education system. So there was a lack of a plan, there was a definite lack of a plan from their side to say, what do we do with the existing issues? We're not speaking about new issues here. The existing issues that were already existing, how do we deal with them during a pandemic? And that highlighted a lot of definitely no plan from the DBE to deal with these issues.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Ntiki. I mean, with us at the Equal Education Law Center and as lawyers, this case really for us highlighted really the importance of cases and litigation, which is grounded in movement experiences and in experiences of what's happening on the ground. And immediately when we heard about, you know, as the results of the surveys came through, and as it became very clear that food security was something that was really affecting equalizers, for us that was concerning because we recognized that the right to nutrition and that the nutritious meal forms part and parcel of one's enjoyment of the right to education. And through our research, it was very clear that it's been shown what the links are to having a daily nutritious meal and the right to education. And what was concerning about the NSNP is that currently the NSNP gives 9 million meals to 9 million learners in our country. And so the impact of the NSNP having been stopped was a huge impact, which went even beyond the equalizers who were really saying that this had become an issue. And so we immediately then did research, and we recognized the importance of research because research informs one's activism, research informs one's advocacy, and also helps then to ground the lived experiences and to couch the lived experiences into actual suggestions and recommendations and actual strategies on how to deal with the crisis or the issue. And so we immediately then started, as the Equal Education Law Center, started research on comparative jurisdictions, on what was going on in other countries, on how other countries have dealt with moments of crisis, for example, around Ebola, etc. And we then use that research to then inform the sort of advocacy that we did. And from that research, we then also reached out to other organizations, other role players within the sector to really try and say, look, this is what's happening here. This is the impact of what's happening. And that research then also led to an open letter, or at least grounded an open letter, which we then wrote to the minister to try and say, this is the crisis. This is the impact of this crisis. 9 million learners are not accessing a nutritious meal. And the evidence which had come out from our research was that for many learners, at least also through the surveys, was that for many learners, this was the only meal that they were receiving daily prior to the national lockdown. And many of these learners were now expected to sit at school at home, expected to continue with their education and continue learning without a meal every day. And so through this grounding, through the surveys which had been done with equalizers, the organizing which Equal Education tried to do at the time, together with Section 27, which was representing 2 school governing bodies in Limpopo, we were then able to then couch a case, couch litigation, which was founded and grounded in evidence from the ground, which then went to court in order to argue that the right to nutrition was in fact part and parcel and quite linked to the right to basic education, and that without the right to nutrition and without nutrition, the right to education could not be properly realized. And of course, the end of that was that the court, Dutch Patrol did agree with us. And the effect of that litigation is, of course, that now the right to nutrition, alongside other issues or other components of education, such as transport, textbooks, is now realized as part and parcel of the right to education and as its own self-standing right. And so through that, through realizing that our gains in social change is that advocacy has different layers. Advocacy has layers of trying to do surveys, trying to find out what's going on in the ground, engaging with government and trying to say to them, this is what's happening, researching so that our demands and our expectations are grounded in some sort of research, and then litigating, but litigating which is not removed from what's going on and is not removed from context. That was very important for us in litigating this matter.
Great, thanks, Teho. And of course, linked to what Nziki said initially about ensuring that members, firstly, we get the voice of members. They articulated what the struggle is, what the challenge is. And we engaged with the department. We conducted that research like you spoke about, Teho. But then we had to get this message out into the public domain, just to amplify how huge this issue was. 9 million learners plus, actually 9 million plus learners. And the fact that access to at least 1 meal a day was now, compromised. And the department doesn't think, he says, there's no plan. It's just like, Karabo made reference to this in a different way. I remember the minister saying something like communities will do what they've always done during like school holiday. It was just the most bizarre response, and cold actually. But I just want to know from Demi, could you talk us through how we use traditional media, social media to amplify the issue of school nutrition and its necessity?
Yeah, thanks, Hopalong. And even though it may not seem like it, media and advocacy around litigation is really such a crucial component because it's important to, like you said, raise awareness and to garner public interest in the matter. And obviously, when the NSNP case took place, we were in serious lockdown, and it wasn't possible to gather physically and do certain activities. So it wasn't possible to go and picket outside of the court on the date of the hearing, or to stand outside a department and picket, which is some of the usual go-to sometimes, pre-COVID. And so media strategies really had to draw on the strengths of other platforms and tools that we were already using, but really just intensifying these efforts. So things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, even radio, WhatsApp, and to do this understanding the limitations, that there are many still that may not have had a device that could support that kind of sharing and may not have access to data. But in the NSNP case, I think the people working on communications did a fantastic job. Like already said, there were banners on bridges. There were signposts along the highways throughout Johannesburg. There were radio interviews. There were articles in Mail and Guardian and Daily Maverick on Times Live. And I think EE did a really great job of trying to interact with equalizers, with other civil society in the form of Facebook live sessions, where there was a lot of information sharing, an opportunity to interact live through comment boxes. And these seem like very small things, but they have a really huge impact in trying to distribute the message and to raise things around what was happening with the case. And what I've been told is that those Zoom sessions had received more views than what we would with a normal, standard webinar. So it was really something that was accessible to a lot of people. And there are advantages to using these kind of platforms as well. I mean, of course, we've acknowledged the limitations, but when you're trying to raise an awareness that requires coming to a workshop or having an action outside of a department or court, there's a lot of logistics that goes into that. There's a lot of costs that are incurred, and it's very limited. It depends on the size of the room and how many people you can afford to be there. And using these platforms, suddenly it just broadened out access and interaction could happen on a much larger scale. And I think another important note, particularly with the NSNP case, that was important was collaboration between organizations, EE and Equal Education Law Center in Section 27. It was just this unified effort that really helped keep the momentum with the case.
Yes.
And I think it helped a lot that it was a significant step that we created a campaign around this that all three organizations supported. And shared information widely. It meant that we had greater access to more membership bases and more capacity, so we could achieve a lot more in terms of advocacy and media. So COVID definitely had an impact on the way you had to think, and I think this was done really well with the NSNP case. And it just meant that we needed to intensify the use of tools that we had already used before, but just to kind of strengthen those efforts.
Thanks, Demi. I mean, talking about collaboration, I know that the Center for Child Law and the Equal Education Law Center also did quite a significant amount of work on a court case around learners with disabilities. And you also used different strategies there, slightly different from the NSNP, but I just wanted to hear from Tejo and Karabo about the tactics used there. Tejo, you want to speak about the collaboration that you had and the engagement that you had with the department. And then Karabo, you can just talk us through how the court case came about and the impacts of the judgment.
Thanks.
But let me start with you, Tejo.
Thanks. So at the beginning of March, as I said at the beginning, we had schools closing and we had learners taken back home. And what became very clear to us at the ELC was that in all the plans that the DBE had around remote learning, around learners learning from home, and even around later on rethinking how schools could reopen safely during COVID-19, it became very clear and concerning to us that learners with disabilities had been left out of this thinking and out of this conversation. And from the kind of messaging which we were receiving, or the very minimal communication around learners with disabilities, it was very clear that there was no plan for them. And that despite, this whole mantra that we have about no child left behind, that again, the child with disabilities was being left behind. And what was concerning for us was that for a lot of learners with disabilities, with schools closing, they were required to go home. And for many of these learners, their homes were homes where their parents didn't know how to support them, where these learners were coming from special school hostels. Their parents didn't know how to support them on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, for many of them, schools were the place where they were accessing the kind of support which they need in order to be able to be reasonably accommodated, to participate on a daily basis, just in their lives and also in their education. And so for many of these learners, moving them away from the schooling system was much more layered and meant much more than what it meant for other learners who don't have disabilities. And also learning from home for learners with disabilities meant a lot of them had been removed away from the schooling system where there were assistive devices which enabled them to learn, where there was therapeutic support to enable them to learn. And so these children had been really thrown into a double crisis and forgotten. When we immediately saw that as the ELC, we recognized the need to try and reach out to the various stakeholders within South Africa who deal with learners with disabilities, or at least who have a proximity to schools for learners with disabilities. And we then reached out to various organizations for persons with disabilities, so OPDs, dealing with and quite linked to the various spectrums and the different types of disabilities which we have in South Africa. And it was really an idea, behind it was really together, trying to engage with DBE collectively as one voice, and trying to say that you've forgotten learners with disabilities. This is their demands. This is what they need in order to continue to learn from home, and also to then move on to the discussion about how is DBE going to ensure that they too can return back to school because they've been left out. And it started off with a letter in April to DBE, really trying to conscious of the pandemic, conscious of its unprecedented nature, trying to say, look, these are the considerations you need to make. These are the recommendations which we have. And sadly, that letter went unanswered. We had between March and between the closing of schools in March, going on through April, trying to engage, having two sort of convenings where civil society and OPDs, organizations for persons with disabilities, were welcomed to the table for interactions. But sadly, then we saw on the 29th of May, the DBE then published its directions around, and the directions were really a guideline for how would the DBE ensure that schools could reopen safely, and a timetable around when they'd reopen, what was required, is it a mask, is it this? And sadly, despite the interactions we'd had, there was nothing. There was silence about when would special school hostels open, if at all. When would special schools open, if at all? How would support be given to these schools? Or if these learners are supposed to remain at home, how would they be supported? And really that was the background within which Karabo will speak about, the background within which we ended up having to litigate, because we had tried capacity building, we had tried to capacitate the state, we had tried to engage, we had tried to speak, and it was very clear that unless we litigated, learners with disabilities would continue to sit at home, and that this sitting from home had very far-reaching consequences for them. And so Karabo can then maybe speak to the litigation, and I can also come back in on the litigation, which we then decided to do on behalf of the Center for Child Law, which even though we as the ELC acted for the Center for Child Law, the whole way through that journey of that litigation, the OPD, so the Organizations for Persons with Disabilities, we continued to speak to them to ensure that what we were asking for, to ensure that our asks were grounded in what would work for each different learner, because we recognize that disability is a spectrum and not just one thing that you just,
Yes. Thanks, Tshego. Karabo?
Thank you so much. Yes, I think what Tshego is really touching on is the strategic kind of collaborations, but more importantly also, as she said, linking it with the real issues on the ground and working with people who can guide us, here being the organizations for the principals in relation to what is needed on the ground. So after those attempts then to influence the guidelines, as Tshego said, when they came out, they were still insufficient, particularly in relation to learners with physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and the learners with profound intellectual disabilities and epilepsy. So then that's when we then ELC got in touch with us about the case and the strategy for us to collaborate for the litigation. I mean, even after the guidelines, we did actually try to still tell them that the guidelines do not reflect what we had been engaging with them, what EELC and the principals have been engaging with them about, but that did not amount to anything. So therefore, we had to actually move to issuing court papers to challenge the guidelines and to highlight the fact that they were insufficient. And if anything, the learners who fall under the categories that were left out are going to remain left out, and there's no thought to how they're going to be assisted to continue to access education. So we did then launch the application, the litigation, and then around, and it was issued as an urgent application, and then the department decided then to say that, well, let's consider settlement, and then there were engagements again in relation to the settlement agreement and what would that entail, particularly making sure that whatever is they putting really answers or response to the needs that needed to be addressed for these group of learners to be able to return to school safely. So just to run through some of the things that we did. So where there were issues around hostels. You remember there's limitations about how many learners could be in hostels, and applying that to learners with disabilities. I think Tshego mentioned the fact that so many learners end up in hostel schools for children with disabilities in the hostel because there are not enough schools. We know that there are big issues about not having enough schools for the learners in the country. So there had to be a provision to amend the limitation on that category or the amount of learners, so that the schools could accommodate more learners, obviously still ensuring that the learners are safe. But the reality of it was that if you don't do that, you have so many learners not being able to return to school. Maybe later Tshego can just highlight how we've monitored this implementation of this court order, and actually some learners have still not returned because there's so many barriers and obstacles to their return to schools. and that the schools should also be provided with additional infrastructure, for reasonable accommodation of the learners, again, in the hostels, because quite a lot of learners in the hostels could not return. And one of the things that were coming up was the fact that the principals and even the teachers themselves and the carers were saying, some of the people will never return if they're not great efforts made to try and make sure that the guidelines accommodate them returning sooner, because the longer they stay away, they might not return. And obviously also that the guidelines must provide health and safety measures designed specifically for the learners with disabilities in the schools and in the hostels. So you can't apply, the general guidelines without taking into particular the needs of the learners' specific disability. So that also had to be amended. And also that there should be a provision for appropriate learning and teaching support materials and assistive devices and therapeutic services for learners who cannot return to school. It's a very difficult thing. And as I said, the monitoring has indicated some of the obstacles that came with that. But needless to say that, the department did amend the guidelines, and Equal Education and has done, Law Center has done a lot of monitoring with Zita here from our office. And I know that they're preparing a report in relation to how this has played out on the ground, and whether it helped the lived realities of the learners with disabilities, which I think is very important. Every time we talk about litigation, we ask whether it really translates to making a difference, and this is how we do it. We all are aware that our court orders must mean something, the report is a mixed bag, because it does say that in some respects there's been some success, but there's some learners who've disappeared because there's not enough support. They will not come back. Parents have lost jobs, and they're not bringing the learners back. So all those problems that Nziki kind of mentioned in the beginning affect and are even more exacerbated for learners with disabilities, because they've always already been kind of left behind. And that's why there's a need to intensify the work around access to education for learners with disabilities. Maybe let me leave it there, Hopes. Thanks.
Okay, Taba, I'm gonna actually throw this back at you, because you did like a nice segue for us into the next theme, which is monitoring, as part of activism. And I'm not sure if between you and Tejo, who could kind of talk to us about how you've been monitoring what came out of the settlement order around the court case around relating to learners with disabilities.
Can I defer to Tejo, because I think she's been more involved in, yeah.
I'm happy to come in here, Hobbs. I think with monitoring and the work of monitoring, or envisaging the work of monitoring, already starts when you're litigating and when you're seeking the relief that you seek. And when you're couching your relief in such a way that you've empowered the people who that order directly affects to be able to monitor, you're kind of already envisaging, as you seek your relief, what do we need? How can this order assist us with our monitoring work? And for example, so with learners with disabilities, and for example, we did something similar in NSNP, which Demi will speak to, but in learners with disabilities, for example, we had room for us, for the DBE, after they drafted the sort of guidelines which we said they needed for each specific disability. So we said, you need guidelines for learners who are deaf or hard of hearing, you need specific guidelines for learners who have epilepsy. So we kind of said to them, there's different sort of needs for these different disabilities. We got the court to order that they needed to go and they needed to draft these sort of guidelines, but that they needed to come back to us for us to give input on these. And that allowed, for example, in the monitoring, for those who were affected, or those who represented or spoke for those who were affected, who sat in OPDs, to then have a role to play to say, actually, you got this completely wrong, or actually you've said, you've admitted the fact that actually for learners who are blind, we need a little bit more, we need more sanitizer because there it's more sensory. Actually, you've done this. And so in that way, it envisages then a collaborative role, or it envisages those who are affected continuing to have a role or play a role in the implementation of what happens, because it directly affects them, and empowers them to also have some sort of voice in what affects them. And through that process and that backwards and forwards, which wasn't an easy process, it still needed work, and there's still a lot of work to be done after we get our orders. And I think it's important that as litigators, who do public interest litigation, we recognize that it doesn't stop at the judgment. And in fact, if it stops at the judgment, we've then failed those who we say we represent, in my opinion. But anyway, so there was that. And then also in the monitoring, there was also then creating easy material, popular material, which we then distributed to schools for learners with disabilities, so that they knew, what could I ask? What does this order mean? What do the guidelines which have been published, what do they practically mean for me? What asks can I make? What demands can I make? And then that's part of the education, the very important education work of the judgments that we get. And then also then obviously, and it's a lot of work, and we still need to, as lawyers, you know, get it right, and we need to, it's a work in progress, but it's then also speaking to the principals, asking what's happening, what's going on. Something we've seen, particularly in the disability sector, and perhaps you would have also seen it in equal education with the schools you work with, is intimidation of principals. And so principals being scared. So where a principal says to you, actually, I know this direction says this, but I'm scared to challenge the DBE. And so again, the work for us as lawyers is also trying to take away this notion of speaking to government being something which is adversarial. And so bringing their trust in the law and building their power through the law so that they are capacitated to use the law. So that's kind of the way we've monitored the implementation of this order. And there's still a lot to be done, Hobbs. And a lot.
I mean, I think it's a critical point, and I think the NSNP it doesn't face similar challenges, but the same applies within the NSNP as well. Just the actual implementation has been fraught and difficult, but it's happening. It's happening, but it's just very, very difficult. And if you take your foot off the pedal, as an organization, as civil society, as a social movement, then it's all going to go to hell, unfortunately.
It's a sad reality, but obviously a discussion for another day around.
Perhaps Demi, can you come in on NSNP? And Ziki, I'm gonna close with you for this particular component of our discussion, and then we'll.
Yeah, Hoppelang, thanks. I think from within the topic of monitoring, from a litigation perspective, a good mechanism for this is the structural order, however imperfect this may be. And just to give the audience a bit of an idea of what the structural order looked like in the NSNP matter, it was directing the minister and provincial education departments to submit plans on how they were going to roll out the NSNP, and then provide progress reports every 15 days on how this was happening. And the progress reports had to be quite detailed. It had to be information on the steps that were taken, when these were taken, the results of these steps, so how many learners were being fed, further steps that might be taken, and when these could happen. And I think the reason why this was such a strict oversight was because it was in response of something that was exceptionally urgent. And the harm that would have been caused if the department hadn't started doing something immediately was going to be detrimental. It's not often that you see reporting having to happen within a 15-day time span. And I think this is one of the reasons why, because the matter was just so urgent. And as others have alluded to already, it's not a perfect solution. And we saw this happen with the NSNP. Unfortunately, provinces failed to submit reports on time. And even with all their plans, it was still clear that about 1.5 million learners were still not being fed. And so it led to another round of litigation. But even in this, we still asked for a structural order. In a way to just be able to monitor what exactly the DBE was going to be. And in terms of the second structural order, the DBE and the provinces were asked to go back and to revise these plans and to come up with something that was realistic and something that was responsive within a month of the order, and then to come back once a month on progress reports as well. And I think what was really innovative in the second round was certain considerations had to be taken into, certain factors had to be taken into consideration when the DBE was revising its plans. For example, it needed to make provision for communication plans, like how learners would know when they could get, how the programs were going to happen. And like I said, there was a need for it to be realistic and responsive. So a number of things had to be just more contextualized and considered in this new, in the new plans. And then progress on this has to be reported on as well. So once a month, the DBE and the ministers need to or the MECs need to provide progress on how implementation is happening, whether the steps taken were successful or not, what further steps on the pipeline, and when. And I think while the structural order is good in terms of a monitoring tool, it must be recognized that it has its challenges. Sometimes civil society and even law clinics don't have the capacity to monitor as well as what we could. It's an influx of data, and this can be very, very burdensome. Also, like we see, the state just doesn't do what they're asked to do, even if there's a court order. And sometimes it's difficult to collect information on the ground so that you're actually able to measure the data that the state is giving you to actually find out if this is even true. But having said that, it is still an important way of getting data, of being able to analyze and evaluate what the DBE is doing. And so I'm still in favor of the structural order as an oversight mechanism and as a way of giving civil society information to use in order to, direct the steps that it wants to take to try and get redress.
I mean, Tiki, you did a lot of work around, and still, it's sort of in past tense, it's happening now. You've done a lot of work with our members around, with our organizing team around monitoring the implementation of the school nutrition program. You've done a lot of work around monitoring the reopening of schools and whether the necessary infrastructure is there. What is your perspective on just seeing what is actually happening on the ground? Is it easy? Is it difficult? Is it necessary? What's your view?
It's necessary. Reason being is that I think something that Utseho was also saying, that it's just a sad reality, right? Our government will agree on something and not implement it. It's easy for them to agree on something and not implement it. And part of us making sure that, because as NGOs say, tend to be for the ground and we are for the masses. So we can't just say, okay, we have won this victory and then leave it as it is. It's because the victory is important. It's very personal to our people. And I think it's necessary to do this monitoring. Always sit here with this like amazing victories, court case, but there's nothing on the ground. There's no implementation that is happening. And I think the important part of the monitoring is making sure that there's correct implementation. And some of the things that we've been doing through the implementation of the NSNP, which is the National School Nutrition Program, is to even going into local radio stations to say, there's a victory of NSNP. This is how it's supposed to be. There's supposed to be 9 million learners that are supposed to be fed. And I think the last time we had about like 6 million learners that were fed, and plus 3 of them million we're still not getting these meals. And part of it was to doing community activations, right? Because one thing we should also, and that we're doing as NGOs, and to always remember to do, is that we might win these court victories and have these amazing court victories and all of this, but they also belong to the ground, right? And it is important for the ground to take ownership of that. And I mean, the people that are directly affected by this. And part of that was to do community activation, to educate communities. When I mean communities, I mean schools. I mean, like within the community, going door to door to say, we came to educate about the NSNP and the importance of a child to get NSNP during this time. And during these times to do like these small surveys with learners to say, are you still receiving school meals? Is the meal how you're supposed to? Because there was a point in time where we actually asked for an alternative, right? In the days that you're not at school, can you actually get the food parcels? Because there are learners who are having to walk from to go to another village, like 4-hour walk to just get it and a meal, right? Which is really important, but also we can never run away from the fact that they could have maybe gotten a food parcel to be able to sustain them throughout the weeks that they're not at school, because we have the rotation system that is taking place. But I want to say also what is important is, and what the government has taught us, unfortunately, is that we can't just say we have a victory or won a court case and then sit down. We need to do the monitoring, or nothing is going to happen. It's just going to be beautiful in paper. We need to monitor it because we know the importance of, and we know the impact it plays within the groundwork and within our learners. So it is important for us. And I don't know if and every time when we do this monitoring, when we've won these victories, I think for me, I don't know if it's a question of the government, they just don't care, or is it a question of capacity? Because also you can't just implement, like say, I'm passing something, you deal with it. It's your thing, deal with it. That's what they've been actually doing. And I think it's important for us to start challenging even the government there, because they are the people that are, we are challenging these things because it's a right, right? It's a right. We shouldn't be even demanding it. It is a right. It was supposed to be given to you. And now we're having to fight to get it, but also after getting it, we even have to fight more to receive it and make sure that it's going to according to plan. So this is something we really need to challenge our government on, but it's very necessary to do that, to check the progress also. Thank you.
Thanks, Ntiki. I'm very mindful of our time because we're running 10 minutes over, but if people can bear with us for 5 more minutes. Tejo, I see your hand. Could you segue into a way forward? You know, what learnings do we want to take from this moment in terms of the work that we do, how we litigate, how we organize, mobilize, how we conduct our media work, how we collaborate, you know? What does the future look like? Because as Ntiki said, we are in the middle of COVID. We aren't over it, probably not gonna be over it for a long time, especially in relation to the education sector. So if you could just briefly touch on that, and then I'll move to Ntiki to also give her 50 cents there.
Great, thanks, Hobbs. I think for me, it's 3 things. The first one is centering of grassroots. I think in all our work, whether it's advocacy, whether it's monitoring, whether it's litigation, all of that must be centered by grassroots and informed by them in order for that social change to be felt and for them to be enabled to carry it. And collaboration. I think collaboration has really come out of COVID-19. And when I speak about collaboration, I don't just speak about collaboration between civil society, I also speak about collaboration and the relationships we build with government, right? Where we don't just see our work with government as one which is adversarial. Yes, you know, and this word adversarial, I don't think that that's our role. We are not adversarial to government. Or you don't have to be. And then the other one is building state capacity. And I think it's around recognizing our role as civil society to build state capacity. I think, for example, and I think it's a very important one around monitoring, is parliamentary monitoring and recognizing and not taking for granted the role which we play, and also ensuring that grassroots experiences are taken to Parliament, that we use our parliamentary monitoring roles in order to inform parliamentarians, in order to inform portfolio committee members of what is going on, because that's the very crucial role that we play. The reality is that Parliament is there to basically hold the executive to account, and we have a role in making sure that as they deliberate, they know what's going on in the ground, and that monitoring can also inform our work, because a lot's going on there. So those are my main things. So recognizing our role vis-a-vis the state and government, and trying to just reconsider how that looks like, how is it best placed, and also grassroots. Our work is nothing without that centering.
Thank you, Tejo. I see Ntiki nodding. Do you want to tell us, just give us your perspective on what you know, how we continue with our work? I'll give you 30 seconds to 1 minute.
So I think Tejo has captured me when she spoke about grassroots, right? And I think that's the way to go about it, right? Making sure that grassroots is, sorry, there's like a lot of people in the office like preparing for youth groups. So I think grassroots is the way to go about this, creating the agency and giving the agency to the people that are directly affected by these issues. But continue to fight. That's the only way we're going to win and change the education system. And I also always say to the young equalizers and like young activists is that the saddest part is that no one is going to do it for us. We are now that generation, and we need to fight for it, and we're going to get it. I believe the struggle continues, and no one is going to do it for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ntiki. Karabo, briefly, how do you see us moving?
Yes, I agree with what all the panelists have said, and I think one of the biggest learnings and great thing that we managed to do is to collaborate under very difficult circumstances. And I think going forward, we must build on that. When we have one voice and we put pressure, we seem to be able to get things moving very well. And obviously linked with what Nontsikelelo said about linking it with the lived realities of the children. So that is very important. And the last point is that we must always also remind people like education, when they come and say, oh, I just provide education, that, you know, children's rights are not, you can't silo them. They are interrelated, and we must also remind and do our research and our advocacy in that holistic kind of approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Karabo. And then Demi, your perspectives before we close off.
Yes, so mine is pretty much just from a media perspective. And I think although restrictions are starting to ease up now and physical gatherings are slowly but surely still being allowed, I think it's important to still keep using the media platforms that we've been using so creatively in this time, because of the advantages of being able to reach so many people. And I think with ending off needing to, to work and strengthen grassroots media and advocacy is really crucial in order to empower communities and to raise awareness about issues. And I think the focus here should be on access. And I think that some of the platforms that we've been using now can really help strengthen that. And I know I focused quite a bit on what had happened with the NSMP case, but I know what I've seen some of our comms in Section 27 do is create materials for WhatsApp that can be shared more broadly, and offering like a hybrid access, so to workshops and information sessions, so people can come physically or join online. And I know with some of the vaccination trainings that took place over community radio, which suddenly means that it's a local platform used by the community in a language that they could understand a bit better, and things like Instagram Live. I think we can really take these tools and these initiatives forward, going forward.
Thank you so much, Demi. I just want to tie it all together. We've been interchanging the word advocacy. I've been thinking about it as activism. Nziki says the struggle continues and the struggle is ours, or at least, the younger generations. But yeah, clearly activism is multifaceted. Clearly, the struggle to create a quality, a good education system for our the most vulnerable learners in our society is going to take a lot of work from organizations such as ours and a lot of strategies to get to that point, because we can't leave it in the hands of the state alone. I think the things that really came out strongly for me, as Karabo said, collaboration. As I said before, obviously we've been collaborating, we've been, there are all kinds of coalitions that have existed pre-COVID. But in this moment, I think because, resources are limited within civil society, capacity is limited, we banded together. And I think amazing work has been done during this time to really agitate. And then there's organizing, of course, and we have to organize under the most dire circumstances. But as Nziki mentioned, we've had to be quite creative about what we do to connect, to ventilate the struggles that people are facing, to bring them along on this journey, not just to take something from somebody and run with it and they don't know what's happening. Litigation, Teho and Karabo have spoken extensively on this, and Demi, the pros, the cons, the downfalls, the wins, why it's necessary, when is the right time to litigate. And COVID obviously made it very odd, should we, shouldn't we? But in some cases we knew we should. And then of course there's the amplifying, which is the media work. So I'm really hoping that folks have taken something from this conversation around how we move and we fight for our struggles, that there's no linear process, that we tap where we can, we work together where we can. In fact, if anything at this point, I think we're all advocating that we work together. And that we clearly need to still push much harder to ensure that the impact of this pandemic on learners isn't felt for years to come. We anticipate it will be, but we need to at least make an attempt to try and fix it. And with that being said, I thank you very much for your presence here, taking the time to be here, staying on here. Definitely a big thank you to our panelists who made this a very engaging discussion, and good afternoon.
Thanks, comrades.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.